Join me as I brave the scariest winter nights and see if I can handle the chills without losing my cool. There's something about winter nights that sets the tone for scary stories. Maybe it's the darkness that falls early, or the way the wind howls through the trees like a mournful cry. Whatever it is, winter nights have a way of tapping into our deepest fears, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in this video. Winter nights can be unsettling, to say the least. The darkness seems to press in on us, making us feel claustrophobic and anxious. And then there are the sounds, the creaks and groans of old houses, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of unknown creatures in the woods. It's no wonder that our imaginations run wild on winter nights, conjuring up all sorts of terrors that lurk just beyond the edge of town. But it's not just our imaginations that make winter nights so frightening. There are real stories, too, of strange occurrences and unexplained events that have taken place on dark winter nights. Stories that make us wonder if we're truly alone, or if there are forces beyond our understanding that lurk in the shadows. Winter nights have a way of heightening our senses, making us feel like we're walking on eggshells, waiting for something to go wrong. The isolation, the heavy silence broken only by eerie sounds, and the knowledge that help might not be close by amplify every fear. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind rattling the windows, feels like a warning of something lurking just out of sight. And it's not just the setting that makes winter nights unsettling. There are countless tales passed down through the years about mysterious figures in the snow, spectral visitors appearing by firelight, and chilling encounters that defy logic. These stories remind us that perhaps winter nights aren't as still and peaceful as they seem. Let's dive into 4 chilling true stories that will make you think twice before venturing out on a cold, dark winter night. Story 1. The Shadow in the Snow. There's something about being alone in the wilderness during winter that amplifies every sound, every shadow, every creeping sensation of being watched. For John, a 38-year-old writer seeking solitude for his latest novel, this isolation was exactly what he craved. He rented a small rustic cabin deep in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow, snow-covered road. It was the perfect retreat. No neighbors, no cell service, just peace and quiet. Or so he thought. The first few days passed uneventfully. John spent his mornings writing and his evenings by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. The cabin had an old-world charm, creaky wooden floors, a fireplace that crackled soothingly, and a single lantern that cast flickering shadows across the walls. But soon, John began to notice things that unsettled him. It started with footprints. After a heavy snowfall one morning, John stepped outside to gather firewood and saw a clear set of footprints leading up to his porch. The tracks were deep, suggesting someone had been there after the snow had stopped during the night. But what struck him as odd was that there were no tracks leading away. Whoever or whatever had made them had vanished. At first, John rationalized it. Perhaps the snow had drifted over the returning tracks, or maybe he hadn't been paying attention when he arrived at the cabin a few days earlier. But the thought nagged at him. That night, as he lay in bed, the creaks of the old cabin seemed louder, the wind more insistent. He told himself it was just his imagination, fueled by the eerie footprints. The next day, the footprints were back. This time, they weren't just on the porch, they circled the cabin. John's unease deepened as he carefully examined them. The prints were larger than his own boots and clearly defined, as if made by someone standing and walking slowly around the cabin. Again, there were no returning tracks. Determined not to let his nerves get the better of him, John set up a camera by the window facing the porch. That night, he sat by the fire with a mug of coffee, keeping himself awake and listening intently to the sounds outside. Hours passed, and the storm outside grew heavier, the wind rattling the shutters. Just as he was about to call it a night, something caught his eye. Through the frost-covered window, John saw movement near the tree line. He squinted, thinking it might be a deer or another animal, but what he saw chilled him to the core. A shadowy figure stood motionless among the trees, partially obscured by the falling snow. It was too far to make out details, but the figure was unmistakably human. John's breath caught as he debated what to do. He considered calling out, but quickly decided against it. Grabbing his flashlight, he shone it toward the figure. The beam illuminated the trees, the snowflakes sparkling in the light, but the figure was gone. The following morning, John retrieved the footage from the camera. As he scrolled through the recordings, his heart raced. Around 2 a.m., the camera captured movement. The shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the porch, standing perfectly still for several minutes. Then, without stepping back into the snow, it simply faded into the darkness. John's logical mind couldn't process what he'd seen. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But deep down, he knew better. Something was out there, and it was watching him. That evening, he locked the doors and windows, drew the curtains, and kept the fire blazing. But despite his precautions, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he lay in bed, his flashlight within arm's reach, he heard a faint tapping at the window. When he mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there, just the reflection of his own terrified face staring back at him. Yet the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if trying to coax him outside. The next morning, John packed his belongings and left the cabin, abandoning his retreat. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and could swear he saw the shadowy figure standing on the porch, watching him leave. John never went back, but the experience stayed with him, haunting his thoughts every winter. To this day, he can't explain what he encountered in that remote mountain cabin. Was it a person, a spirit, or something far more sinister? Whatever it was, it had been there, in the snow, watching, waiting, and it didn't want him to leave. Story 2. The Silent Visitor. It was a bitterly cold winter evening when Emma, a university student, decided to make the drive back home to her family. The semester had ended, and she was eager to spend the holidays away from the stress of exams and papers. Her hometown was a few hours away, and she was confident she could make it before nightfall. The roads were slick with ice, and the snow fell in heavy, swirling patterns, reducing visibility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma realized she was further from home than she'd thought. The only lights came from the occasional passing car and the headlights of her small sedan cutting through the darkness. About an hour into her drive, Emma saw a sign for a rest stop and decided to pull over to stretch her legs and grab a coffee from the vending machine. The place was eerily quiet. A single flickering streetlight illuminated the parking lot, and the building itself seemed to blend into the shadows. She parked her car, zipped up her coat, and stepped out. The air was icy, biting at her exposed skin. As she walked toward the rest stop's entrance, she had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She paused, looking over her shoulder, but there was nothing, only her car and the empty lot. The rest stop was small and sparsely furnished. A few benches, a row of vending machines, and a single dimly lit bathroom. Emma quickly bought a cup of coffee and sat down at one of the benches, trying to warm her hands on the steaming paper cup. She checked her phone, but the signal was weak, and her texts to her mom failed to send. The stillness was unnerving, and she found herself glancing at the door every few seconds. That's when she noticed it, a man standing by the vending machines. He wasn't there when she'd walked in. Emma hadn't heard the door open, and yet, there he was. The man was tall, with a heavy coat and a scarf that obscured most of his face. His presence wasn't overtly threatening, but there was something about him that set her nerves on edge. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the vending machines as if deciding what to get. Emma tried to ignore him, focusing on her coffee, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. She glanced up again, and this time he was closer, only a few steps away from her table. "Long drive?" he asked suddenly, his voice muffled by the scarf. Emma forced a polite smile. "Yeah, heading home for the holidays." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at her. His eyes were dark and unblinking, and the longer he stared, the more uncomfortable she felt. "Well, safe travels," he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Emma nodded, eager for the conversation to end. As he turned and walked away, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She decided it was time to leave. Gathering her things, Emma stepped outside into the freezing air. The lot was still empty, and her car was the only vehicle in sight. But as she reached for the driver's side door, she noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow, her own, leading from the car to the building, but also another set, fresher, leading away from her car and around to the back. Her heart began to race. The footprints were large, likely from a man's boots, and they hadn't been there when she arrived. She quickly scanned the area, but saw no sign of anyone. Emma climbed into her car, locking the doors behind her. As she started the engine, the headlights illuminated the parking lot, revealing nothing but the swirling snow. She shifted into reverse, but before she could back out, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. A dark figure was standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the dim light. It was the man from the rest stop. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching her. Panic set in, and Emma didn't waste another second. She threw the car into gear and sped out of the lot, her tires slipping on the icy pavement. As she merged back onto the highway, she kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see headlights following her. But the road was empty. Emma didn't stop until she reached her parents' house, her nerves frayed and her hands shaking. When she recounted the story to her family, they tried to reassure her, suggesting the man was probably just another traveler or a worker at the rest stop. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been there by accident. A few weeks later, Emma saw a news report about a missing person last seen at the same rest stop. The police released a sketch of a suspect, a man with dark eyes and a heavy coat. Emma felt her stomach drop. It was him. To this day, she wonders what would have happened if she'd stayed just a little longer, or if she hadn't noticed the footprints. The thought sends a shiver down her spine, a chilling reminder of how close she may have come to a far worse fate. Story 3. The Frozen Hitchhiker. It was a frigid December evening, the kind where the air seemed to crystallize with every breath, and the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly under the pale glow of a full moon. Jake, a truck driver, was on a long haul through a remote stretch of highway in northern Minnesota. The roads were slick, the radio static-filled, and the only company he had was the hum of his engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming cars. Jake had been driving for hours, his thermos of coffee long gone cold, when he noticed something up ahead. A figure stood at the edge of the road, barely visible through the swirling snow. As he drew closer, the form became clearer. A man in a tattered coat, holding a sign that read, "Duluth." Jake hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers was a gamble, especially in such isolated areas. But the man looked desperate, shivering violently in the cold. Jake couldn't just leave him there to freeze. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The man climbed into the passenger seat without a word, his face pale and gaunt. He looked to be in his late 20s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed almost unnatural against his pale complexion. "Thanks," the hitchhiker mumbled, his voice barely audible over the heater. "No problem," Jake replied, trying to mask his unease. "Duluth, huh? That's a bit of a drive. You sure you're okay out in this cold?" The hitchhiker didn't respond immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting stiffly in his lap. "I just need to get there," he finally said. The conversation didn't pick up from there. Jake tried to make small talk, but the hitchhiker's curt replies and distant demeanor made it clear he wasn't in the mood. The silence in the cab grew heavy, broken only by the sound of the tires crunching against the icy road. As they drove, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hitchhiker's presence was unsettling. His clothes seemed out of place, thin and worn, more suited for autumn than the dead of winter, and yet he didn't seem bothered by the cold. About an hour into the drive, Jake glanced at the hitchhiker and noticed something strange. His hands, which had been resting on his lap, were now clenched tightly into fists, and his knuckles were a shade of blue that didn't seem natural. "You all right, man?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with concern. The hitchhiker turned to him slowly, his eyes locking onto Jake's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "It's colder than I thought," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. Something about the hitchhiker's tone sent a shiver down his spine. He decided to focus on the road and get to Duluth as quickly as possible. A few miles later, Jake noticed something even stranger. The cab, despite the heater running full blast, was growing colder. He could see his breath fogging up in front of him. "Must be the weather," he muttered to himself, though he didn't fully believe it. The hitchhiker, however, didn't seem affected. He sat rigidly in his seat, staring straight ahead with an expression that was now completely blank. As the temperature in the cab continued to drop, Jake's unease turned to fear. His hands were numb on the wheel, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He glanced at the hitchhiker again, and this time, he swore he saw frost clinging to the man's eyelashes and hair. "I think we're going to need to stop and check the heater," Jake said, hoping the suggestion would break the oppressive silence. "No need," the hitchhiker replied. His voice was different now, hollow and distant, like it was coming from far away. Jake's heart raced. He turned his attention back to the road, his pulse pounding in his ears. The headlights illuminated a sign for a rest stop just a mile ahead. Desperate to escape the increasingly eerie situation, Jake decided to pull over. When they reached the rest stop, Jake put the truck in park and turned to the hitchhiker, but the passenger seat was empty. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the vacant seat. There was no sign of the hitchhiker, no footprints on the snowy floor mat, no indication that anyone had ever been there. Jake stepped out of the truck, the icy wind biting at his face. He scanned the area, but the rest stop was deserted. The only sound was the whistling of the wind and the creaking of nearby trees. Shaken, Jake climbed back into the cab and slammed the door. He turned the heater up as high as it would go, trying to banish the cold that seemed to cling to his bones. As he pulled back onto the highway, he couldn't shake the image of the hitchhiker's piercing blue eyes or the frost that had inexplicably formed inside his truck. When Jake finally reached Duluth, he told a fellow trucker about the incident. The man listened carefully, his expression grave. "Sounds like you met the frozen hitchhiker," the man said. "There's an old story around here about a guy who froze to death on this highway years ago. They say his spirit still wanders, looking for a ride to Duluth." Jake laughed nervously, but the truth was, he couldn't dismiss the story. The memory of the hitchhiker and the unnatural cold stayed with him, a chilling reminder that some roads are haunted by more than just bad weather. Story 4. The Shadow on the Slope. The final tale takes us deep into the Rocky Mountains, where winter's icy grip transforms the landscape into a snow-covered wilderness. Hannah and Marcus, an adventurous couple, had decided to spend their holiday in a remote cabin nestled on the edge of a steep mountainside. It was a dream getaway. No cell service, no distractions, just the two of them and the pristine beauty of nature. On their third night in the cabin, a heavy snowstorm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow. Despite the weather, the couple remained cozy by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and enjoying the warmth of the crackling fire. As the hours passed, the storm intensified, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. Around midnight, Marcus decided to step out and bring in more firewood from the shed. Hannah insisted he take a flashlight, but Marcus laughed it off, saying the moonlight reflecting off the snow was bright enough. A few minutes after he left, Hannah heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow, followed by the door creaking open. "Back so soon?" she called out, but there was no response. She turned to see the door slightly ajar, snow blowing in through the gap. Marcus wasn't there. Confused, Hannah went to the door and peered outside. The wind was bitter, and visibility was poor, but she could make out fresh footprints leading from the cabin toward the slope. "Marcus!" she called out into the night, her voice carried away by the wind. There was no answer. Grabbing her coat and a lantern, Hannah followed the footprints. They led to the edge of the slope, where the land dropped steeply into the forest below. She stopped in her tracks, staring at the imprints in the snow. They ended abruptly, as though Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. Panic began to set in. She called his name again, her voice trembling, but the only response was the eerie silence of the snowstorm. Clutching the lantern, she scanned the area, her breath fogging in the icy air. That's when she saw it. A shadow moving in the trees far below. It was too large to be an animal, and moved with an unsettling, unnatural fluidity. The lantern flickered as Hannah tried to focus on the figure. It seemed to be pacing at the edge of the forest, its outline obscured by the swirling snow. "Marcus," she whispered, though deep down she knew it wasn't him. The shadow stopped, as if it had heard her. Slowly, it turned in her direction. Though she couldn't make out its features, Hannah felt its gaze lock onto her, an oppressive weight that made her knees weak. Suddenly, the shadow darted toward the slope, moving with impossible speed. In a panic, Hannah turned and ran back to the cabin, the wind cutting through her coat like knives. She slammed the door shut behind her, bolting it tightly, and collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Moments later, she heard something outside, soft, deliberate knocks on the door. "Let me in," a voice whispered. It was Marcus's voice, but something was off. It sounded distant, hollow, like an echo of his real voice. Hannah's heart pounded as she stared at the door. She wanted to believe it was him, but her instinct screamed otherwise. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Hannah hesitated. She moved toward the window, peeking through a gap in the curtains. What she saw made her blood run cold. Standing outside the door was a figure cloaked in darkness, its form shifting and flickering like a shadow cast by an unsteady flame. It wasn't Marcus. It was something else, wearing his voice like a mask. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. "Let me in," the voice demanded, now distorted and guttural. Hannah backed away from the door, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. She didn't dare respond. Instead, she retreated to the bedroom, locking the door and huddling in the corner. For hours, the knocking continued, accompanied by the haunting voice. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the storm that the sound stopped. When she finally mustered the courage to open the front door, there was no sign of the shadowy figure, but Marcus's footprints remained, leading to the slope and vanishing at the edge. Search and rescue teams combed the area for days but found no trace of Marcus. The incident was ruled an accident, a tragic disappearance caused by the treacherous conditions. But Hannah knew the truth. She knew that something had been out there that night, something ancient and malevolent, lurking in the shadows of the slope. She left the cabin shortly after, never returning to the mountains. To this day, she warns anyone who will listen. If you ever find yourself in the wilderness on a winter night and hear a voice calling to you, no matter how familiar it sounds, don't answer. As the shadows of winter nights grow longer and the cold presses closer, we are left to question what is truly lurking in the darkness. The most terrifying part of these chilling tales is not just the unknown, but the palpable fear of being utterly alone, at the mercy of something beyond comprehension. In the case of Marcus and Hannah, the terror of the shadowy presence on the slope was not just a fleeting encounter. It was a relentless, oppressive force that followed them long after the storm subsided. The feeling of being watched, of something ancient and malevolent, was enough to break their sense of reality and fill their minds with doubt. What was that shadow on the slope? Was it some entity that had been awakened by their presence in the mountains? Or was it something far older and more dangerous, bound to the land? The shadow was not content with simply appearing once. It wanted something more. The knock on the door, the voice calling out to Hannah. These were the tactics of something that sought to toy with its prey, to make them question what was real and what was imagined. That is what makes this tale so chilling, the relentless nature of the entity and the unsettling truth that it had marked them as its next victims. The boundary between the living and the supernatural had blurred, and the horrors of the winter night had seeped into their reality. The most frightening moment, of course, came when Marcus disappeared, his footprints vanishing as if he had been swept into the night by a force beyond his control. It's impossible to ignore the sense of finality that comes with his disappearance, as though something had claimed him, leaving no trace, no evidence. The haunting voice outside the cabin door was not just an eerie sound, it was a harbinger, a reminder that once the darkness takes hold, it is far from finished. Hannah's survival is a testament to the chilling truth that some forces in this world are far more terrifying than anything we can understand. While Marcus may have fallen victim to the shadow, her escape was not one of victory, but of sheer, blind luck. And yet, even after leaving the cabin behind, she could never escape the feeling that something still lingered in the darkness, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too far. In the end, the shadow on the slope is not a story with a happy resolution. It is a reminder that winter nights hold dangers we may never fully comprehend. The cold air, the howling winds, the eerie silence of the snow, all of these things serve to hide what is truly lurking just out of sight. And in the coldest depths of winter, when the world feels most isolated, it's not just the creatures of the forest that we should fear. It's the things that move in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. So the next time you find yourself out in the cold on a winter night, alone in the darkness, remember the shadow on the slope. And remember, not everything you hear on those nights is just the wind. As we've ventured through these chilling true winter night stories, it's become clear that winter holds a unique kind of fear, one that grips our minds and hearts with the cold, dark, and mysterious forces that inhabit the world around us. From abandoned asylums and ancient entities to shadows stalking remote mountain slopes, these tales tap into our deepest fears and remind us that the winter night is not as empty and quiet as it may seem. Whether it's the sense of being watched, the unsettling creaks of old homes, or the inexplicable disappearances of loved ones, these stories have shown us how the darkness of winter can awaken something far more dangerous than just the cold. They echo the idea that the most terrifying things in life are often the ones we cannot explain, the things that remain just out of sight, waiting to strike when we least expect it. In every one of these stories, we find ourselves questioning reality. Was it all in their minds, or was there something truly supernatural lurking in the winter night? These eerie experiences leave us with more questions than answers, as they force us to confront our own fears and the possibility that, just beyond the edge of our understanding, there are forces at play that we may never fully comprehend. The chilling stories we've shared tonight, of strange occurrences, supernatural forces, and inexplicable disappearances, have one thing in common. They remind us of the vulnerability we face in the dead of winter. It's a time when the world feels empty, when the long nights seem to stretch on forever, and when the unknown feels closer than ever. But perhaps that's the most frightening part of all. Winter is not just a season. It's a time when the boundaries between the living and the unknown seem to blur, and the shadows grow long, waiting for their moment to emerge. Thank you so much for watching tonight's spine-chilling tales. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, I'd love to hear about your own winter night experiences. Have you ever felt something lurking in the darkness, or heard strange noises that you couldn't explain? Share your stories in the comments below, and let's keep this chilling conversation going. And if you're brave enough to face even more terrifying tales, Be sure to check out my next video. We'll be diving deeper into the darkness and bringing you more eerie adventures that will haunt your dreams. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story from Hauntline. Until then, stay safe, and remember, on winter nights, the shadows are never as empty as they seem.